First thing, of course, if everybody would please turn off their cell phones. So thank you everybody for coming. My name is Linda Finken, and I chair the Culture Club that puts these things on. And really glad to see you. There were a lot more people who registered. A lot of people are always late, but maybe more will come as we're waiting. And we are also going to record this, and we'll post it in a week or so and send out the link to everybody who registered. Rabbi Woodsman is going to introduce our speaker.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lynn. Thank you for being instrumental for all these programs.
And thank you to Alex for resolving the tech issues.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Alex. What will we do without Alex? So, if you are like me, in this terrible last almost 3 months, you want to spend time with people that feel like you. I have no patience for people who this is not the most important thing in their life, because they're talking about an existential moment, not only for the state of Israel, for the Jews all over the world. If you are like me, you realize that every Shmegege became an expert on Middle East. Everybody knows what happens, what will happen, and who is the fault, and I also don't have patience for this kind of people. But when there is somebody who really knows, and somebody who, when she speaks, people listen, when somebody, when she writes, people read, this is a very uplifting moment. And this is what brings us tonight to listen, to try to understand more and to feel. And that's why it's a privilege to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Shoshana Bryen. Shoshana is the Senior Director of the Jewish Policy Center in Washington, D.C., from where she joined us tonight. Ms. Bryen is a leading specialist in both U.S. defense policy and Middle East affairs. She has worked with the Strategic Studies Institute in the U.S. Army War College, as well as with the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. She has lectures at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. She previously was Executive Director and Senior Director for Security Policy at the Pro-Israel GINSA, which is the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. Ms. Bryen coordinated programs in the Middle East for military professionals that allow more than 450 American military officers to engage in professional discussion of issues among the United States, Israel, and Jordan. She also created a program that takes the cadets of America's service academies to Israel for a 3-week work-study program that has permitted hundreds of future officers to have a positive, in-depth experience in Israel. She has brought Turkish and Israeli military officers to speak at the service academies and has also lectured at the academies herself. Ms. Bryen is a member of the board of the American Jewish International Relations Committee. She runs a weekly webinar series for the Jewish Policy Center, and her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, the Daily Caller, the New York Sun, and Defense News, among others. Once again, thank you for thinking, for making this program possible. And once again, thank you, Dr. Shoshana Bryen, for being with us tonight. Welcome to Bryen.
Thank you. I know you have a lot of questions, and we're going to leave a lot of time for them. So I'm going to give you more of a setup than a day-by-day military account of what's going on. October 7th is sometimes called Israel's 9/11. In some ways it is, but in fact, in other ways, it's more like Israel's Pearl Harbor. We were surprised on Pearl Harbor Day, but we weren't really surprised. We knew what Japan was doing. We knew what it was building. We knew where it was going. We knew what it intended to do. We just didn't know it would be December 7th. So in fact, on December 7th, we were surprised. Similarly, Israel was surprised by the October 7th Hamas massacre, but it had also for a long time been aware of and fighting against Hamas's growing infrastructure, including under the Al-Shifa hospital, which Israel declined, as you know, to bomb in 2009 and 2014. It knew all about what was going on in Al-Shifa. It was aware that Iran and Qatar were funding that infrastructure. It was aware that young men were being trained to kill civilians, that they were training on gliders, that they were training to break through the border fence in large numbers. And they were aware that Israeli civilians were always at risk of being kidnapped. They were surprised on October 7th. Now, exactly who and what and how is responsible for what happened on the 7th, this we don't know. Israel has a history of having commissions after major military and governmental catastrophes. And those commissions are not like, shall we say, congressional hearings. They are serious. And every time they have one, people's heads roll. So I suspect this will be no different. And there will be time at the end of this to look at the culpability of various parts of the Israeli government. But if you're going to look at October 7th and you're going to look at the war in Gaza, it starts where everything in the region starts, and that is with Iran. Iran has spent the past few decades doing a couple of very important things that culminated in October 7th. It was building a conventional weapons capability, including ballistic missiles and drones. It was building a nuclear capability, building militias in the region, in Iraq, in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza. And those militias, by the way, and those armies actually were not just there to surround Israel, but Iran's goal is to topple the governments of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt, which are Sunni countries. Most specifically and most importantly, they are intent upon getting rid of the king of Saudi Arabia, because Arabia is the home of Mecca and Medina, two holy Muslim cities, which are now governed by Sunni Muslims, and Shiite Iran thinks that Shiite Islam should control those cities. So that's really number one, or maybe number two on the intention list. It also needs to get rid of the king of Jordan and the king of Morocco, because both Abdullah II and King Mohammed VI trace their lineage directly back to the Prophet Muhammad, which is the Sunni side of Islam. Iran traces lineage to the Prophet's son-in-law, Ali. That's why they're called Shia Ali, or Shiites. And as an adjunct to all of that intention to control the Middle East, Israel and the Sunni Arab countries, Iran declared war on the United States many years ago. Now, lately, Iran has been worried because Israel is becoming much better integrated into the region. You have the Abraham Accords, you have the rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, there were better relations with Egypt. Even countries that were not interested in the Abraham Accords figured they had other fish to fry. They were not interested in going to war with Israel. And as Iran watched that, they worried. Now, sometimes weird things pop up in the Middle East. I'm sure you've seen that. There was a meeting of the Islamic Conference a couple of months ago, and you probably saw pictures of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Sultan, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, shaking hands with the president of Iran. What was much less reported on was an Algerian-sponsored resolution, which is essentially an Iranian-sponsored resolution, that essentially declared war on Israel. It was shot down by the Sunni Arab countries. So Israel finds itself with a blocking vote in the Islamic Conference. And I think that's funny, but it made Iran very nervous. At the same time, Iran was watching Israel. And in the broadest sense, Israel helped Iran think that this might be a good time for a war. In Israel, as you know, all through the summer and all through the fall, you had demonstrations against the government. And this led the Iranians to believe that Israel was not a stable and sound society. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, Israel was providing enormous numbers of work permits to Gazans. 18,000 Gazans were working in Israel every day with permits at Israeli wages. And it turns out, though, that some of those people were spies for Hamas. So Iran looked at that setup and they said to itself, two good things work for us. First, the IDF would not be a cohesive fighting force. You remember the stories about reservists not showing up for their reserve duty, which, by the way, was not true. Reservists were showing up. But Iran was fomenting this idea that the IDF wouldn't fight. And number two, they believed that the United States would not support Israel. So they were completely wrong on the first, mostly wrong on the second, but I'll get to that in a second. So that's how you get to October 7th. The Iranians were mucking around looking for the right time. Why October 7th? Why not June 10th or February 4th or any other day? It was a good weekend. It was Shabbat and it was also a major holiday and maybe people's defenses were down. That's when it came out. So then you get to the war. Okay, I'm not going to do, as I said, I'm not going to do battlefield updates. You can find them anywhere online. I do suggest if you want day-to-day battlefield updates, go to jinsa.org, JINSA.org. They will give you all the daily battlefield information that you need. But there are a couple of things that you should know about the IDF. First of all, it recovered very quickly from whatever mistakes it made on October 7th. The Army was formulating new plans within 24 hours. And those plans have worked. There was no place in which Hamas has pushed back on an Israeli entry into a city, a town, a headquarters, or anything else. Second thing to know is that Netanyahu was probably also right that a very fast and very hard pushback was necessary to shake the idea that Hezbollah might want to attack now, or Iran might want to attack now. When they saw the Hamas leadership being eviscerated in Gaza, they decided this is not a good time for an all-out attack on Israel. And I think Hamas was a little bit surprised by that. The next thing to know is that Hamas's ability to launch rockets into Israel is not over. They still have rockets, they still launch them, but it has been decreased considerably. One of the reasons it has is that Hamas's high-level commanders have been picked off in the middle of this, and the mid-level commanders are almost entirely gone. That's where you got those pictures of, the guys surrendering in their underwear. A lot of those guys came out of their holes and they said that their leaders were gone, their commanders were gone, and it seemed to them that the best idea was to surrender rather than getting killed in the tunnels. And that's why they came out. They were in their underwear because the Israelis know that these people wear suicide belts and suicide vests, and stripping them close to naked was a good idea. It also should be understood, though, that Israel agreed to a ceasefire for a number of days to get a number of hostages back. And that probably increased Hamas's capability substantially. Hamas was surprised by the power of the Israeli invasion of Gaza, but giving them days to re-coordinate, rethink, replan, repurpose helped them very much. And you notice that Israeli casualties have gone up since the ceasefire failed. And that is a result of the first ceasefire. On the other hand, it should be said that Israel agreed to do another ceasefire, and it's Hamas that will not agree to it. So that's the setup. But there's another part of this that I think you need to be aware of as you watch. Not only is American support for Israel waning in some quarters, but a lot of people, Jews, non-Jews, Americans, Europeans, who were initially supportive of Israel because of the horrors of October 7th, are now doing what we call the proportionality thing, saying that Israel has killed too many Palestinians, and it isn't proportional to the killing that Hamas did in Israel. Would you please kill that thought? Because aside from the fact that all Gaza casualty numbers come from the Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health, you should note that Hamas has not announced a single military casualty. Okay? According to them, it's all civilian casualty. You know this is not true. But Israel, in terms of proportionality, is on the right side of international law and remains there and will remain there. The first thing that enemies do is yell war crimes, proportionality, genocide, because it resonates with people. I suggest a more rational response. There are laws about going to war, and the IDF respects those laws. All ethical armies respect those laws. That would be the US Army. That would be the Israeli Army. Proportionality in international law is not about the equality of death or civilian suffering, or even about the firepower used being equal to the firepower received. Proportionality weighs the military necessity of legitimate military action against the suffering that action might cause to enemy civilians. Okay? Even friends of Israel get it wrong. There was a guy on British television defending Israel, and he said, do you want proportionality? Should Israel seek out young women in Gaza and rape and torture them? Should Israel find babies and murder them, or murder their parents? His metric was wrong. His metric was wrong. The second problem we have is what we call the yes, but response. Yes, Hamas started it. Yes, Hamas tortured and massacred people. Yes, Hamas puts military infrastructure in civilian neighborhoods. Yes, Israel is entitled to self-defense. But so many Palestinians have been killed. No, that is not the definition of disproportionate, and it is not the definition that controls ethical armies. Professor Horst Fischer of the International Law and Peace, the Institute for International Law and Peace in Armed Conflict at Ruhr University in Germany, wrote the following, and I'm just going to quote him. When a party commits a lawful attack against a military objective, the principle of proportionality comes into play whenever there is collateral damage, that is, civilian casualties or damage to a non-military objective. Attacks are prohibited if they cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, or damage to civilian objects that is excessive in relation to the anticipated, concrete, and direct military advantage of the attacks. So Israel is weighing the tunnels, the arms in the schools, the rocket attacks, and the need to end those things. And then there is civilian damage that is caused alongside of that. So you have to weigh the value of getting rid of Hamas's military infrastructure against the civilian casualties. And again, we don't know how many civilian casualties there are. What about this problem of schools and mosques and hospitals? And they made a big deal out of Shifa Hospital. I rarely quote the International Committee for the Red Cross, which is a stinky organization, but they did write about the protection of schools and mosques and other establishment, and I will quote them just because I have to. Specific protections of medical establishments and units, including hospitals, is the general rule under international humanitarian law. Therefore, specific protection to which hospitals are entitled shall not cease unless they are used by a party to commit outside their humanitarian functions and act harmful to the enemy. The expression act harmful to the enemy is not defined under international humanitarian law. Nevertheless, the rationale for the loss of protection is clear. Medical establishments and units enjoy protection because of their function in providing care for the wounded and the sick. When they are used to interfere directly or indirectly in military operations and thereby cause harm to the enemy, the rationale for their specific protection is removed. And that would go for every school, every hospital, every, I don't know, whatever, every street in Gaza, because we know that Hamas was underneath all of them. And they were providing aid to the military of Hamas. Second concept you need to keep in mind, and that is motivation in war. It's not as precise as proportionality, but it's more like you know it when you see it, okay? Motivation is what made Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan different from the Allies in World War II, regardless of which side suffered more civilian casualties. It is what defines ISIS-supported massacres of Christians in Africa. It defines the genocide of Muslim Uyghurs in China, Tutsis in Rwanda, Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. It differentiates the mullahs from the Iranians who are arrested and jailed by the regime. And it makes Hamas's war against Israel different than Israel's war against Hamas. On the one hand, you have Hamas hunting down, torturing, raping, and murdering Israeli civilians in their homes and at a music festival. They baked a baby in an oven while his parents were tied to a chair, okay? The rape of Israeli women was accompanied by torture. Hostages are dying in Gaza. That's one side of this war. On the other side, you have the destruction of the military infrastructure of Hamas in Gaza, which Hamas, funded by Iran and Qatar, deliberately put under the homes and streets of the civilian population, which turns the civilian population into human sacrifices. I don't usually use Nazi analogies, but there was a Nazi defendant at the Nuremberg court who made the proportionality argument. And the Nuremberg court responded to the Nazi with the motivation argument. The court said, the notion that this Nazi defendant was trying to make that the deliberate and purposeful killing of civilians was equal to the taking of civilian lives that is undesired, unintended, and unavoidable is absolutely rejected. Those are two completely different things. And the Nazi went to jail. Okay, so now with your setup, let's look at the US role, and only for a couple of minutes. Rhetorically, the Biden administration is very good. Actually, they're great. And the US veto in the United Nations is something that we should be proud of. But the actions of the United States are problematic. First of all, a lot of this comes from choices that the Biden administration made. Biden took the Houthis off the US terror supporting list in one of his first acts in 2021. And now the Houthis are firing on ships in the Red Sea, ours, French, everybody else's ships. There was $6 billion unfrozen to Iran in the first 6 weeks of the Biden administration in 2021. They used the money to pay their arrears at the UN, and they joined the UN Commission on the Rights of Women. They have thankfully been removed from that role, but it joined the Human Rights Council, and that's equally bad. Iran's foreign currency reserves were at a low of $15 billion in 2019 under the US plan of maximum sanctions. The IMF estimates that today they're over $42 billion, and they are rising by billions of dollars every month, partly because we have given waivers for Iran to sell oil to China, which helps China, it helps Iran, it doesn't help anybody we like. The US brokered a maritime border deal between itself and Israel and itself and Hezbollah in Lebanon. The result of this is that Hezbollah gets money from the exploration of natural gas and oil in the Mediterranean Sea. Hezbollah promised to be nice. You think they've been nice? They have not been nice. But that's what we did. It supports Iran. Again, more recently, it was discovered that the drones that Russia's using in Ukraine to kill the people that we call our Ukrainian allies are Iranian. And they were sold in violation of UN embargoes on the sales of those things. So what the Russians were getting away with was killing our allies with armaments that they got illegally from our adversaries. We did nothing to stop the UN from lifting its embargo on Iranian production of ballistic missiles. And the US is supporting an independent Palestinian state, which I think is sort of the last thing that we should be doing at this moment. So Iran had the idea that the US was going to be on its side, and we took very specific steps to help them with money, with weapons, with infrastructure, and with allies in the region. Now the Iranians are trying to decide whether they should go to war against us. They've ramped up their Houthis. US forces in Iraq and Syria have been attacked more than 150 times since President Biden took office. More than 103 rocket and drone attacks have occurred since October 17th. Houthi terrorists, as I mentioned, are firing on ships in the Red Sea. And the US response has been generally very little, very little. We knocked off some depots in Syria. Somebody said they were empty. I don't know. But this week, an American soldier was critically wounded. It's the first time. A lot of guys come home with traumatic brain injuries from the concussions from the shelling of their bases. But this was the first time that a soldier had been critically injured. So we may be changing our policy. And at the same time, the US is telling Israel very specifically, telling Israel not to escalate against Hezbollah attacks in the north. 100,000 Israeli civilians have been removed from the north of Israel because of Hezbollah rocket fire. They don't want to go to war. They want to harass Israel. They want to keep part of Israel off balance. They want to make Israel feel that it may have to go to war on a different front. And the US is telling Israel not to do anything about it, which is why Israel should not be, and I don't think it is, taking military advice from the US. Last point, post-war politics. People are already trying to figure out what to do with Gaza after. We don't know what after will look like. It's like starting the Marshall Plan in 1942. The job has to be finished first. But the United States, unfortunately, cannot seem to help jumping forward with a plan. We have a plan. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken went to Tokyo to present his plan. I don't know why he was presenting it in Tokyo, but there he was. And here are the points of Anthony Blinken's plan. No forcible displacement of Gaza Palestinians, not now, not after the war. No use of Gaza as a platform for terrorism. No reoccupation of Gaza by Israel after the conflict ends. No attempt to blockade or besiege Gaza. No reduction in Gaza territory. We must also ensure that no terrorist threats emanate from the West Bank. Thank you, Mr. Blinken. We must also work on affirmative elements to get a sustained peace, including the Palestinian people's voices and aspirations at the center of post-crisis governance in Gaza. And finally, it must include a Palestinian-led governance and Gaza unified with the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, and it must include a sustained mechanism for reconstruction in Gaza and a pathway to Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in states of their own with equal measures of security, freedom, opportunity, and dignity. Sounds great, right? It is not great. It is a recipe for reigniting the Palestinian Civil War of 2007, which the PA lost, as well as providing unwarranted gifts to the Palestinian Authority, which created the so-called Second Intifada. You might remember in 2000, they killed more than 1,000 Israeli civilians. That is a US population equivalent of nearly 40,000 people. And the PA to this day continues to teach and incite violence in its schools. It steals enormous sums of foreign aid from donors and the people. Abbas has a net worth of about $36 million on the low end, about $100 million on the high end. If anybody has numbers like that, please let me know. I don't even know what that sounds like. Abbas authorizes the payment of salaries to terrorists, including Hamas terrorists and their families. This is a violation of the U.S. Taylor Force Act. And by the way, something I must admit I had forgotten and I was just reminded of. If you are a Palestinian terrorist and you serve time in an Israeli prison and you are released, you are guaranteed a job in the Palestinian Authority, which means that the Palestinian Authority is top to bottom. The more years you spend in prison, the higher the job you get in the Palestinian Authority, which means that top to bottom, the Palestinian Authority is an institution run by terrorists pretending to be civil servants. So I wouldn't. So what would I do? I don't know what you do exactly because I don't know what it looks like. But I will say that after World War II, the United States and the Allies occupied Germany and Japan. There is no question, there was no question, who was going to make the rules, including the rules about educating people, including rules about where people would live. In a normal war, meaning a war that doesn't involve Israel, the UN might create a coalition of the willing, as it did after the fighting and the breakup of Yugoslavia. My daughter was a member of the task force that went to Yugoslavia. It was the UN and it was the Allies who made the rules for how the various constituent parts of Yugoslavia were going to relate to each other after the war. And if you notice, Croatia and Slovenia and Slovakia and Kosovo and Bosnia managed to get along pretty decently, even after the really horrific Yugoslav war. So there are ways to do this, but the United States has already decided for Israel that Israel will not be a party to what happens in Gaza afterwards. And that post-war governance is not about international forces, but about Palestinians. And I think Palestinians, the one thing they've shown you, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, is that they have not given up their intergenerational belief that Israel has to disappear. So I would say, as I conclude the prepared part of my remarks and ask you for questions, the war in Gaza is going about as well as a war against a kind of, I don't know, vampirish, ghoulish, war criminal terrorist organization can go. But the future looks like a lot of trouble based largely on US policy and its unwillingness to engage with Israel. So I thank you for your attention and I welcome your questions. I think I scared you. You're muted. I don't know if you know this, but I can't hear you. Your microphone is muted. You need to turn it on.
I'm sorry. Is it better now?
That's better. Thank you.
My question is that why can't somebody somehow get the countries, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, to take in the people from Gaza where they originally came from? Nobody wants them. And if they went to other countries, maybe something would be better.
Well, yes, that's one of the things the Allies did after World War II was create population movements that worked for the Allies and what they thought would be future peace. But if you notice, shoving the problem on Israel is simply what they've done since 1947, 48, 49. When Israel signed a peace treaty with Egypt, the Camp David Accords, Egypt said to Menachem Begin, I'm not taking back Gaza. And Begin said, no, it's yours. You have to take it back. And Sadat said to Begin, you can have Camp David and you keep Gaza, or you keep Gaza and there's no peace. I mean, we're not doing it. So Begin made the strategic decision that he would take the Camp David Accords, remove Egypt from the circle, and keep Gaza. And he was correct, but this is what it led to. When Israel signed a peace agreement with Jordan, Yitzhak Rabin and King Hussein had this conversation, and King Hussein said, they're not my problem anymore. They're your problem. And again, Rabin was confronted with either I have to keep the West Bank or I don't get a peace treaty with Jordan. And he took the peace treaty. And none of these guys want them. I'll tell you why Egypt doesn't want them. Egypt is terrified by the concept of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas is the Sunni Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is funded by Iran, which is Shiite. But overarchingly, they share the objective of hating the West and hating Israel. Egypt spent years getting rid of the Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt, and they don't want to bring it back. And I will tell you, the UAE doesn't want it either. They spent also 10 years getting rid of those guys, and they don't want them back. So the Palestinians are simply unwanted, and they've made themselves unwanted.
Somebody must have a question. Well,
Hi. After this war, there are probably going to be a lot of kids in Gaza growing up without parents, without family, and with a deep hate of Israelis. So looks like it's going to be a cycle that's going to be repeated in 20 years from now. And so there's pretty much no solution to the problem. I mean, we're going to have people in Gaza hating Israel forever, because the same way that Israelis don't like the people in Gaza because of, they have to suffer because of that. So how can this be solved?
How does it get resolved? You're asking, of course, the unanswerable question. But I actually heard somebody say, I heard two things this week that give me some hope that there are people actually thinking about this in a constructive way. First was an article that you can find on the Jewish Policy Center website, which is jewishpolicycenter.org. And it was written by a doctor named Mordechai Richter. He's an epidemiologist. And his principle goes like this. He studied for many years the effects of toxic environments on the health of people. In other words, the reason that you had to get cigarette smoke out of houses to protect the physical property of children, the way you had to take toxic chemicals out of mines to protect the miners, and all the ways that toxic environments affect the human body. He posits that the educational system in Gaza is a toxic environment and you have to remove it. And he argues for the introduction of an entirely new educational system and that people need to be re-educated, which, by the way, is precisely what we did in Germany and Japan. That if the environment changes, the people change. By the way, there were Jewish communities living in Gaza, as you know, for decades, and they had relations with their Gaza neighbors. And Hamas was introduced to this later, after the Israelis left. If there was one major strategic mistake that I think Ariel Sharon made, it was the withdrawal from Gaza. When you withdraw from a place, the bad guys show up behind you. There was no Hamas in Gaza when Israel was in there. So Dr. Richter posits that you can change the atmosphere and change the poison. That's number one. And there's another author, I haven't posted her piece yet, but I will. Her name is Rena Cohen. She works with Abraham Accords countries. One of the things that the UAE has been working on with Israel is a rail line between the Arabian Peninsula and Israel to take certain kinds of cargo overland out to Israeli ports into the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, that's just something the Abraham Accords allowed for. Now that you have this problem in the Red Sea of shipping, UAE has not backed off the Abraham Accords. They are working harder and faster to do this rail line. And one of the things that the UAE wants is a port on the Mediterranean. Now, if you combine Israeli security, and it has to be Israeli security, with UAE money, a rail line, a port, Saudi interest, Abraham Accords interest, you can change the toxic environment of Gaza. It's not impossible. Would you have said you could change the Nazi environment of Germany in 1941, 2, 3? No. By 1950, we were looking at Germany as a potential member of NATO. It has to be done, though, from the roots, and you cannot leave the bad guys there. You cannot leave Hamas there, and you cannot leave the Palestinian Authority there.
Shortly after October 7th, all the campuses in the United States, majority of them erupted, funded by Hamas, the Students for Justice in Palestine. And that continues, it permeates through social media. And if you look at recent polls of 18 to 25-year-olds and maybe 25 to 40-year-olds, they're on the wrong side from the Israeli point of view. So the Biden administration, looking ahead to elections, is trying to hedge their bets, and I think that's maybe affecting their support for Israel. I just wanted to see if you have any comment on how to turn that around so that there's a less, less pressure and more education for the American public on what's really going on.
I would suggest we remove the toxic environment, you know, and to some extent, it's actually already happening. What you really have is not just Hamas supporters. There are not enough Hamas supporters in this country to make a dent in American public opinion. But there is an alignment of what do we call them? Progressives, the left. There's a word for it. I lost the word. Anyway, there's this enormous left-wing anti-Israel coalition that is able to bring out, and it's very well funded, by the way. It includes Black Lives Matter, includes all kinds of other things, feminist movements, and they align against Israel because they see Israel as a colonialist power, an occupying power. They didn't used to, the left used to really like Israel. They stopped liking Israel when it became wealthier and when its standard of living rose and when it became a part of the first world, not the third world, which if you remember back to 1948 or 67 or 73, it was a third world country. It was a very poor country. As it got richer, as it got more high tech, the left lost its enthusiasm for Israel and it began to glom onto the Palestinians because that was the opposite of liking Israel. So you like the Palestinians. And it's this that needs to be broken up. And this left-wing agglomeration, this is what needs to be broken up. And I think there is some evidence that you can do it. It will be difficult. I think the first thing we need to do, and this is good for the United States as well as the US-Israel relationship, DEI has to go, okay? Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a racist way of separating people into racial categories and ethnic categories, and it is contrary to the way we think about things in the United States. The good news is that DEI jobs have fallen by about 45% in the last 12 months. Schools have to get rid of those people. Schools have to go back to being places where students come and exercise themselves and their brains. Maybe we'll get there, maybe we won't, but that's what we need to be demanding. If we do, maybe we'll get someplace. By the way, some very anti-Israel left-wing guy at Stanford University was about to be appointed the head of the Anti-Semitism Commission. And with an objection, with huge objection from students and faculty, he was forced to resign. So it's not that it's impossible. It can be done. You have to work on it. And by the way, I'll point out one other thing. A lot of the schools did not want to crack down on violent protesters because they are students here on visas. And if they are arrested, they can be deported. And if they get deported and they're Arabs, countries like Qatar will stop giving the universities money. So you also have to start looking at where the universities get their money to see who it is they're going to tolerate. And we have to make them stop tolerating that. If you want a good book, by the way, on the subject of how that coalition came together, there's a book called The Israel Test by George Gilder, Gilder. It's a great book that explains how the left came together against Israel, and how you get Queers for Palestine, I will say, is still beyond me.
My next question is, can you hear me? Okay. Israel seems to show a lack of resolve and steeliness in dealing with the current situation. In fact, this functionality, how is this going to play out?
Wait, I didn't hear the first part of the question clearly. Could you do that again?
Israeli leaders seem to show a lack of resolve in dealing with the situation.
I got it. Israeli leaders are showing a lack of resolve. No, I think actually they're showing a great deal of resolve in the face of American pressure to stop doing what they want to do. It's hard to say no to the United States. I mean, truly, sometimes we miscalculate. Israel is a little tiny country, and without the US veto, for example, in the UN Security Council, life will not be good for Israel. Without the assistance of US CENTCOM in the Red Sea, life will not be good for Israel. There are lots of reasons for Israel to take the United States seriously. But I think Israel has decided in this case, ultimately, it will do what it needs to do. And Yair Lapid, who was the biggest opponent of Benjamin Netanyahu that you could imagine, went to Germany and he made a speech, and he made a fabulous speech about the resolve of Israel and the government and the Jewish people to do this thing. I think it's remarkable, the unity that you have in Israel to get the job done. And I think the government will respond to that. I hope it will.
You said that the only hope for Gaza is that it's absent any Hamas, that it's absent the PA, and that it's absent radicals. Well, who's going to be left in Gaza, especially given the fact that you have so much tacit support for Hamas, as every poll has shown? The only logical solution that you're suggesting is that either the United States and or Israel take over and run Gaza on a day-to-day basis with police forces there. You're not suggesting any logical alternative.
I don't see any logical alternative, to be perfectly honest. If you say that the Palestinians have to govern themselves beginning the day after the war, then that is not a logical alternative. If you say you want an international force, as the UN has provided for other countries, and at the moment is proposing to take over the country of Haiti. You know, the UN is looking for countries that will take over Haiti because Haiti is not a governable country. But in the absence of that, you really don't have a lot of good choices. The only choices, in my opinion, are Israel and a potential coalition of the willing, where Abraham Accords countries might find it in their interest to join Israel. I don't see anything else that's logical. And the US has said no to that already, but I think the US will have to reconsider. Because what else are you going to do? You are absolutely right. There are not a lot of logical answers to this question. And again, I say, I look at Nazi Germany. I never, ever, ever want to go to that analogy, but we're there. We're there, people. Passive support for Hamas was like passive support for the Germans. I'll tell you one good thing that General Eisenhower did, among other good things. Do you remember that he took the civilians in Germany to the concentration camps before they were cleaned up, before they were the Auschwitz Museum, and he made them look at and understand the disgusting and revolting things that their leadership had done to people, to Jews, to Roma, to people with disabilities. He made them look at it. And the reason he said he wanted them to look at it was because in another generation, he said people would say it never happened. And he wanted these people to know that it happened. And the education starts with those sorts of things. People have to be instructed in what their leaders did. And they have to see it all.
I don't see how you can draw an analogy with these Hamas people. It says in the Quran, we must hate and kill Jews. That was never true. That was never true of the Germans. Not to say that they were any good, but starting from the very beginning, they're taught to eat, live, and breathe hatred for us.
Okay, I have to say that is true of some interpretations of the Quran and not true of other interpretations of the Quran. One of the problems of the Quran is that for many, many hundreds of years, the Arab scholarly leadership didn't let anybody translate the Quran into the languages that people read. We, as you know, translate the Bible into a million languages, the New Testament and the Old Testament, a million languages. There are shoots of Islam that are entirely the opposite of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Shiite fundamentalists. There is Islam in South Asia, which is not hostile to Jews. And that's partly because some of the things that we think are Islamic are actually Arab culture. And Arab culture is in many ways very hostile to Jews. South Asian culture is not hostile to Jews in general or anyone else. Look at people like Hindus and Jains and Buddhists. They are by and large live and let live people. And when you put Muslims in those cultures, they have that culture. So I would be very hesitant to label the worst of Arab culture as all of Islam. It's a mistake. Arab culture in some ways is okay. Arab culture in some ways stinks. Arab culture in some ways is anti-Semitic. It's very violent and very, very warlike. And that's where Islam came from. It's not where Islam is. And even among Islamic scholars, Jerusalem is called the city of the Jews. Jesus is called the rabbi to the Jews. I mean, you have to pick and choose very carefully here. I'm just going to reject the notion that all of Islam is the same as all of the worst of Arab culture.
First, thank you for your remarks. I have a question. You mentioned the Arab culture. What's your take on the way the Arab Israeli reacted since October 7th?
Arab Israelis? This is interesting. Arab Israelis have proven themselves to be loyal citizens of the state of Israel. There was a lot of Arab Israeli heroism on October 7th. Arabs have done an amazing job in Israel of not joining the bad guys, of not supporting the bad guys, but overtly supporting the state of Israel. Okay, there are Arabs in the military, they are proud of it. There are Druze in the military, they are proud of it. For people who thought, and I have to say that there's been a lot of incitement in the Israeli Arab community over the last 6 or 8 months as these judicial reform demonstrations were going on. People were kind of utzing the Israeli Arab community as well. But the war brought them to a realization that they are in the better place, and they have been remarkably solid Israeli citizens. And by the way, let me say something about another group that gets maligned periodically. Part of the judicial reform demonstrations were also demonstrations against the ultra-Orthodox who were not drafted into the IDF. And a lot was made out of that, about the exemptions that they get and how they're not good citizens, and how, you know, and people dumping on ultra-Orthodox people. More than 2,000 young ultra-Orthodox Haredi men, not nationalist Orthodox, but Haredi men, enlisted in the IDF after October 7th. More than 2,000 of them, closer to 3,000. And that was a huge eye-opener for the secular Israeli culture. The other thing that pops up periodically is the role of Zaka. Zaka has the worst job in the state of Israel. It cleans up body parts and bodies after wars and terrorist bombings, and it is an ultra-Orthodox organization. By Jewish law, not only do bodies have to be buried respectfully and parts of bodies buried respectfully, but even things like blood and skin and bones have to be taken from those sites. And Zaka went to the south and went to the Negev, and Zaka cleaned the Negev. And they respectfully and carefully found and buried 1,200 people. And so that changed the view of the role of Orthodox people in Israeli society as well. So what you see in Israel is the good news. I mean, a horrible situation. Nothing could be worse than October 7th, really. I mean, very few things could be worse. But the ultra-Orthodox Arab citizens, the Druze citizens, Christian citizens, all came together to defend the state of Israel. And I think you have to just look up and say, thank you, God.
Thank you. We're learning a great deal, so thank you so much. What has become increasingly clear, although we already knew it, but it's now very blatant, is that the head of the snake, Iran, is what makes all this possible. None of this is possible funding-wise, militarily-wise, without Iran's input, and you referred to how Iran was enriched during the Obama and the Biden administration, and now has greater capabilities militarily and financially because of those sanctions that have been reduced. We've even heard from, in the good cop, bad cop game that's played in the administration, blame placed directly on Iran. They've said the word Iran many, many times, saying this comes from Iran. They can call it the head of the snake.
Wait, I'm sorry, you're breaking up, and I'm not quite getting where you're going.
Okay, I'm asking about, since it's now so clear that Iran is what enables all this to happen, and it's been made clear by people like Blinken in the good cop, bad cop scenario that's being played by the administration, but clearly putting the word in the name of Iran out there as the enabler. What will it take? Do you see any possibility that the West, led by the United States, Germany, France, Israel, will finally cut off the head of the snake?
So if you know where the threat comes from, and we do know the threat comes from Iran, at some point, perhaps you have to decide whether you're willing to go to war against that threat. It will not be an easy war. I would suggest, however, that if we do decide that the government of Iran needs to be toppled, it ought to be done before they have nuclear capability. Nothing will make the region peaceful as long as the mullahs have money, arms, and an arms industry. They're being financed not only by us now with oil sales, but China and Russia are buying their weapons. They are financing the Iranian arms industry. And by the way, it's a very good arms industry. They have very talented engineers. They are capable of creating very good weapons, and this is a very big problem for us. So as long as that happens, Iran is going to continue to foment the trouble that it does. And look at the wreckage they've already caused, right? Iraq is not a real country anymore. Syria, 500,000 Syrians were killed in the Syrian civil war, which was an Iranian war in Syria. 11 million people are refugees. 5 million outside Syria, 6 million inside Syria. See, and when you look at the numbers in Gaza, by the way, please remember Syria, 500,000 dead people, including Syrians who were killed by chemical weapons dropped on them by the Syrian government. So Iran has wrecked country after country after country, and it has to be stopped in some way. Now, there were hopes that the Iranian people could have a revolution and overthrow the government. We did not take them seriously enough. I am afraid that there might have been a time for that, but we didn't take them seriously enough, and I don't know that they can do it anymore. It's a pit, but in that pit, the government has all the power. And if you're looking to fix the region, you have to look to fix Iran. No choice, no way out.
Thank you for everything. A lot of information. You're very useful. I am thinking in terms of what happens when this war ends. And you've got Gaza is a total disaster. There's no place for people to live. There's no food. I mean, the food and water crisis is real. And I'm just wondering the cost of just bringing this country to a point where you don't just where people just start dying every day by the hundreds, and the risk of to Israel of having such a place. What do you think is going to happen?
Wait, I'm not quite sure I got the question. You're worried about feeding the humanitarian aid that goes to the Gaza refugees?
I'm not about it so much today, but I am worried about what happens when the war ends. And there's no government. We certainly don't want the PA in there. And so I'm just concerned about what will be the next step. What will we have created?
Well, the first next step, if I ruled the world, there was a song like that on Broadway, If I Ruled the World. One of the things that you have to do, in my opinion, is move the Gaza refugees out of Gaza temporarily. And there's an easy way to do it, and the United States will not do it, and that is to put them in the northern Sinai. I know Egypt's afraid of them. They're afraid that the Brotherhood will reinvade Cairo, but you can put them in refugee camps, and they can be guarded by the United States. They can be guarded by Egyptian troops. They can be guarded by whatever you want, because the Philadelphia corridor, which is the southern part of Gaza, is going to have to be cleaned out, and it will become increasingly difficult to take care of the refugees. Right now, you have trucks going into Gaza, which, by the way, are being commandeered by Hamas, and they're taking the food, and they're certainly not feeding civilians with it. But I think at some point you have to move the refugees. And I'm not sure why people claim you can't move them. You can move them. You have to move them because you have to keep them safe. So if you want to figure out the refugee problem and figure out how to feed them and take care of them, you have to put them in a place that they're safe. Northern Sinai has no Egyptians in it, so it's a good place to temporarily put other people. And you're not moving them that far from Gaza, which means you can return them to Gaza. I don't see much choice, except the United States refuses and says, no, we have to insert the aid sideways. In between the Hamas guys, we insert some aid to the Palestinian civilians in southern Gaza. It's not a recipe for success.
Thank you very much for your information. I'm thinking about, we are talking here about the end of the war, but what happened the next weeks, for example, with the hostages? What do you think that will happen?
No, I'm sorry. Again, this is not a great microphone. I'm not hearing you clearly.
Can you hear me better?
Possibly. Try it, Linda.
Gisella's asking not the end of the war, but starting next week.
Yeah.
What's going to happen about the hostages?
Okay. Here's the mistake that Israel made, and it is the mistake that Israel is entitled to make. Israel thought that the International Committee for the Red Cross would take care of the hostages because that's its job, that's its mission, that's its role in life, to give medicine to hostages, to make sure who's alive, to make sure that people get what they need. That's its job. And Israel assumed that they would get help with this. They have gotten zero help with this. In fact, the opposite. There's a little video of Netanyahu trying to give medicine to the International Red Cross people and saying, you have to take this into Gaza and you have to take this to the people. And the Red Cross guys say, no, we can't, because Hamas will say no. So that's the Red Cross. Now, why do I raise this? Because we no longer have any concept of what happened to the hostages, how many are alive, how many are dead, where they are. Israel got none of the assistance that a country should be able to have when its citizens have been abducted. So what's going to happen to them next week? I am increasingly in fear that they won't live to next week. I don't know how you can't find them, you can't protect them. You don't know where they are. You know that there were people that were sick that needed medication. You know that the ICRC has completely abdicated its responsibility here. And the US, by the way, there are American hostages. The US has said nothing about this. So the other place that Israel had looked for assistance with the hostages was to the US, and it got none. So I live in fear that the hostages are no longer there. And I think one of the reasons, and people understand this, one of the reasons that Hamas stopped giving back young women hostages is that they were raped. They've been tortured by Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And now Hamas doesn't want to give them back because that confirms, not that they needed confirmation, it confirms their war crimes. So I'm extremely pessimistic on the subject of hostages. I pray for them, but I am pessimistic on the subject.
Thank you, Shoshana, for the presentation. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
So you said that the Israeli society surprised us, coming together, united us. We are this year 24 in the time of election. What do we expect of the Jewish community in America?
I'm sorry, Linda, can you repeat it? The microphone is really not working very well. Sorry.
So can you hear me well?
I can hear you, but the microphone is muting your words. It's running things together.
Okay. So we were surprised by the answer of the Israeli society. So what we can expect from the Jewish community in America in this 2024 year of election?
Well, what I would have expected from the Jewish community in the United States is what we got with the demonstration in Washington, where you had 300,000 people demonstrating solidarity with Israel, mostly Jews, but not entirely Jews. What I fear is that there are elements of the Jewish community who are working not in solidarity with the people of Israel. The people of Israel, I think, are on one level, all the people of Israel, and I said this, the Druze and the Arabs and the Christians, on one level. But in the United States, you're beginning to see splitting of the American Jewish community, and that disturbs me greatly. We've got to figure out how to keep ourselves on the side of the Israeli people, because we're really the best backstop that they have. And I am concerned that we are not doing our jobs correctly. We had one great day. I mean, we had one fabulous day here in Washington. Even the weather was great, 300,000 people. But we've got to keep it up, and we're slipping.
Shoshana, I have a question. Based on what you just said, hasn't the Jewish community been split about support of Israel for a long time?
Yes. Yes, you're just seeing it now you're seeing it more clearly now. You're seeing it more loudly now. But yes, there has always been a part of the two parts of the Jewish community. One, which was openly not friendly to the state of Israel, that didn't believe that the state of Israel was doing good things for its people. And then, of course, there's the majority of the community, which is supportive of Israel, But then there was that middle ground of people who just didn't pay a lot of attention to Israel. Yeah, they liked it kind of, and they're Jewish, and that's cool. But those people are susceptible to the lousy propaganda that's coming out now, and that is in fact propaganda in the New York Times. I hope nobody there pays money to read the New York Times. They ran an op-ed piece by the mayor of Gaza City. The mayor of Gaza City is a Hamas party member. He was installed by Hamas. He was not elected by anybody. And the Times gave him a big op-ed about how lousy the Israelis are. So if you are simply a Jewish person who doesn't know very much about what's going on in Israel, but you never had any bad feelings about it, you may perfectly well develop bad feelings about it now. And that's where I suspect the rest of the community is falling apart a little bit. We don't quite know what to do. Maybe with our kids, maybe they went to Hebrew school, but maybe they didn't pick up the love of Israel. Maybe they never saw Israel in big trouble before, and so they don't know what to do about it. I worry about those people being susceptible to propaganda.
Shoshana, I want to thank you for that segue. Talking about our children. In response to what has happened on many of the campuses, there are more and more children who are getting involved in an organization called SSI, which is Student Support for Israel. And it's growing stronger and stronger.
Yep.
And, you know, a lot of the Jewish money has left the major universities.
Yes, it has.
Right, because we said, the loudest said, we're not going to put up with it anymore. And now, in response to that, our children are now getting more and more involved. So
Yes, it goes both ways. There are certainly on college campuses Jewish students who may not have paid attention before, but they surely are paying attention now. I have 4 kids. They're all out of college. My son is a college professor, however. One of my daughters has begun having Shabbat dinner with her Jewish friends because they just feel a need for more Jewish solidarity. Yes, she can come to her parents for Shabbat dinner, but it's a group of 30-somethings, you know, who just want to sit in a room and feel that they are supporting Israel. If by nothing else, then by their prayers and by their observances of, you know, kind of basic Shabbat rituals. I think you're right. I think there are people who did not need to declare themselves on one side or the other. And while some of them are getting sucked into propaganda, others of them happily are pronouncing their Jewishness on campus and elsewhere. And we need to encourage them. I don't know what you do to encourage them. You need to encourage them.
Hi, Shoshana. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us today. I did want to address an elephant in the room. I am a conservative young woman. I'm registered as a Republican, and I know that Israel is going to be politicized next year during the political campaigns for presidential election. And many of these, if not actually every organization that is pro-Palestine happens to be Democratic. There are organizations that are against Israel that are Republican, but none of them are pro-Palestine or pro-Hamas, I should say. So how does an American Jewish person who has Democratic leanings or liberal leanings justify voting for a party that does not support Israel? 8 of the squad started with 4 people, women, who are Democratic. It is now up to 8 people. There are 2 things the 8 people of the squad have in common. They're minority, so Black, Latino, and Democratic. None of them are Republican. And it's a faction that continues to grow. So
wait, stop. I have to stop you there because I have to stop you there because the Jewish Policy Center is a nonprofit organization. We don't do politics. We don't do Republicans. We don't do Democrats. And it's very difficult for me to talk when there's political stuff going on. That's my 501c3 status. Let me just say to you, in the broadest sense, and I am not talking about Republicans or Democrats, there are people who will support Israel and they should be voted for. There are people who do not support Israel and they should not be voted for. If you look at a party, you have to decide what your priorities are, and you vote your priorities. I would strongly suggest that if your priority is Israel, that's what you look for in those candidates. If your priority is, I don't know what, then you're going to vote for something else. I will tell you that I just have to say this because I never thought I would say this in my life. The biggest shocker to me so far has been Senator Fetterman of Pennsylvania, who came out as not only a strong Israel supporter, but also denounced the Squad and the progressives. But it's not by party, it's by candidate. And it's by what you think is important. You will know where your vote should go if you know what matters to you.
Thank you.
That's it. That's all I can say. And this president has a record to run on. If he runs on his record, then you know what you have to do. But thank you for letting me interrupt you. I appreciate that.
Is that it? No, that's not.
Arabs in Israel, basically, those are the Christian Arabs.
No, the Christian Arabs are all in Dearborn, Michigan. There was Dearborn, Michigan. She's asking about the Christian Arabs, but the Christian Arabs were really pushed out, weren't they? There's very few Christian Arabs.
The Christian Arabs, the only place where you have a Christian Arab population growing in the entire Middle East is in Israel proper. I used to go to Bethlehem. I used to take groups of American military officers to Israel, and we did it for 29 years, which is really great. There are no better traveling companions in the world than the American military. Anyway, most of them were Christian. So we would go to Bethlehem and we would go to the church and we would buy things from the stores of the Christians in Bethlehem, and they would take their souvenirs home. And when I started doing this in the early 80s, this was before the Oslo Accords, 75% of Bethlehem was Christian. Today it's 12%. Okay, they are not welcome there. In Gaza, you had 5,000 Christians until Hamas took over in 2007. Today there are about 1,200. Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. In 2007, some people killed a Christian man and woman who ran the only Christian bookstore in Gaza. And ever since then, it's been all downhill for them. So when they said to you right before Christmas that Bethlehem canceled Christmas, no, it didn't. No, it didn't. The Palestinian Authority government canceled Christmas because that's what they've been dying to do for years. And they blamed it on the Jews and they blamed it on Gaza war, and they did whatever they wanted. But Christians have no rights in the Palestinian territories, not the West Bank and not Gaza. And they are being squished all the way through. Only in Israel do they grow and are they prosperous. Baha'is as well.
How much of a Christian Arab community is in Israel?
Oh my goodness. Oh, I can't believe I don't know this. I saw numbers on it. Anyway, all I can tell you is it grew by 1.7% last year. They're having babies. It's not a huge community. I mean, you know, they're a minority inside of Israel and they're a minority in the Arab community. Most of the Arab citizens of Israel are Muslims, but it is the only growing community and it is a reasonably prosperous community. And to the extent that they can, the Christians are leaving the West Bank and they have left Gaza. And if you notice, they left Southern Lebanon as well. Southern Lebanon used to have an enormous Christian Arab community, and they have been forced out of Lebanon over the years, over the decades. Christians from Iraq, there used to be Iraqi Christians. There used to be Iraqi Jews. They're all gone now.
And a lot of them went to Dearborn, Michigan.
It's 180,000. It's not because I know a lot, so I type quickly. 180,000.
Were you able to hear him?
Yeah.
Shoshana, he said that it's 180,000 Christian Jews Christian Arabs in Israel.
Okay.
And the
It could
headline-
be, it could be. The non-Jewish population of Israel is 20%. You know, you can do the math, but if someone said 180,000 Christian Arabs, I would believe that that could be true.
And the headline for that number was, it's the only growing Christian community in the entire Middle East.
Yes, that is for sure. The only growing Christian community in the Middle East. Egypt's Coptic Christians reduced in numbers. Everybody's Christians except Israel's. And I have to tell you, that's one of the things that really angers me about all of this. There's also an enormous number of Christians being killed in Africa by ISIS and Boko Haram and other jihadi groups, which are also funded by Iran. And I don't see an organized Christian response. One of the things that really makes me happy about being a Jewish person is that we do largely as a community get up in arms when something bad happens to our brothers and sisters, wherever they are. And I can't believe that Christians are not paying attention here to what's going on. It is their mistake. And I'm really sort of offended on their behalf. I feel bad for the Christians who are getting killed. And I'm offended that their leadership doesn't stand up for them.
Any other questions? No. Shoshana, thank you so much. It's really been wonderful.
Thank you. You've been a great audience. And I especially want to thank Linda Finken. Linda, thank you for arranging it. Thank you for guiding me through it. I appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Linda.
I just unplugged the speakers. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. So wonderful, as always.
Thank you. It was nice. The questions were excellent. You need a better microphone though.
Say it again?
You need a better microphone. It's not a good microphone. But the questions were really excellent.
And your answers were excellent, but they always are.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you. I will be in touch.
Yeah.
The beginning of the week, I want to see what I can work out. So you're right now, you plan to come in on the 8th and you're tied up, come in on the 7th and you're tied up on the 8th?
No, I'm tied up on the morning of the 9th. That's a Friday.
The 9th, okay.
So it's going to be Friday morning. I haven't decided when I'm coming in. So, you know, we can just talk about that. My bosses are trying to make a couple of other things for me to do in the days up to the 9th. Yeah. So we'll coordinate.
So something, a Wednesday evening or a Thursday morning?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I mean, what I'd really like to see is a lunch and learn.
Lunch is always a good option.
Yeah, we did it once before. Anyway, actually that was done on a Saturday, right after services.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love for you to have more exposure here to this community.
Okay, look, I'm in favor. We'll just work it out.
I'm gonna work on it.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.